Hi, AP worldlings. All right, so here we go. Let's try take number 2. We're looking at the chapter 22 Columbian Exchange Reading Guide. And it begins with a couple questions having to do with the impact of interactions between people. So, question 1, give an example of trade and expansion in the 14th century, that's the 1300s, led to biological exchange and the impact that it had. And then question 2 is really saying, why was Columbus's exchange worse? So we talked about, and here it is in the passage, the Mongols. And as they expanded west into places like modern day Russia, kind of through the North Asian steppes, through the Central Plains, they opened up trade. And so little tiny towns that had been isolated from one another all of a sudden are interconnected, linked by roads and trade networks like the Silk Roads. All right. But what that led to then was not just rats being able to travel down the trade routes, but different organics, plants being traded, crops, animals moving. And that meant that diseases would also move too. So you think of livestock diseases like smallpox and anthrax and those things, those move quicker. Specifically at this time, we're looking at the Black Death, right? And so the Black Death went from Northern Asia and eventually through trade, got onto ships. Those ships went to Europe and then wrecked Europe. Remember, we said one of the big parts of that was that Europe was so densely populated. Everyone lived in these filthy, nasty cities of the Dark Ages. Asia had been a little bit more spread out, and so Europe got wrecked. Okay, now question 2 is looking at why was it worse when Columbus arrived in the New World? And so in the book, it said that those consequences were even worse with Columbus because you're talking about two people that had been completely isolated. Old and New World had no contact. So unlike Asia and Europe that are connected as continents and have been trading with one another for thousands of years on the Silk Roads, the New World and the Old World had never interacted. So imagine how crazy that would be. Something like smallpox that had never been experienced just ravages the New World. They had no immunities to any diseases. Right? And so that's going to be devastating. Look, I've switched sides. All right, so we kind of answered question 3. Smallpox was the big one. Why weren't old world populations like Afro-Eurasians affected? That's because they had lived around domesticated animals that carried the diseases for thousands of years. Right? They knew these diseases, not to sound like a Nazi, but there had been survival of the fittest, right? The families that had lived to reproduce, families that had made it through the plague, families that had made it through smallpox outbreaks, usually had more immunities, antibodies, rigidity against infection. Native populations had no experience with the disease, so they had no antibodies. Okay, so then question 4, what effect did the Columbian Exchange have on the Aztecs? Well, the Aztecs were not one of the people who had any experience or exposure to diseases previously. So the impact was catastrophic, right? So the book says that by 1519, smallpox ravaged the empire and killed as much as 90% of the population of Mexico. So an estimated 17 million down to 1.3 million. All right, that to give you another idea, the island of Hispaniola, the Taino people where Columbus had landed, again, depopulated down to 0. By 1 century after the landing of Columbus, there were no purebred Taino people left. They'd all died of diseases or had started to intermarry with the Spanish, right? So purebred natives had already disappeared within 100 years. So that tells you just how catastrophic we're really talking about with some of these results. So the impact would be that European nations like Spain, Portugal, eventually the Dutch, French, and British, they're going to have a much easier time conquering the New World as a result. That's the global impact. We have a power shift where European nations are able to really expand their power because they basically are feasting on these dying populations, whether in war or just taking their stuff. There's no resistance. And so the New World becomes partially just an extension of the old world. Okay, so benefits. It's not all bleak. So question 6, we're looking at how did it actually help? And the way that it actually did help, and if we look here, the exchange of food is going to be a benefit. And I know it's weird when you think about it, but it's kind of hard to imagine that things like rice and wheat, sugars, bananas, spices, any of the cattle crop, like the livestock whether we're talking beef, swine, horses, none of those things existed in the Americas previous to Europeans arriving. All right, so you're going to have a lot of easier to grow farmable foodstuffs coming to the New World, including dairy production and more manure for farming, all of the benefits. Horses can be ridden for war. Right? So when you think about all the technology that has been developing in the old world around farming, wheat and grasses, cereal crops, domestication of animals, now that's finally in the New World. However, the opposite is also true. The New World had wonder crops, certain things like potato, and corn, and those are really simple agricultural products that can grow, especially potatoes, in really bad soil, harsher climates, and they're hardy, lots of calories. And so places like Ireland, for example, places like the mountainous regions by the Himalayas, those areas can now really benefit from potatoes, although they're not native to that location. It will grow there and it will feed people with these hardy calories. And that means a healthier, more sustainable population in those areas. All right, so let's bring this thing on home. I'm sorry, that was question 5. So question 6. Okay, so to fill in the chart real quick, out of Eurasia, we had things like wheat, rice, sugar, bananas, a lot of the really great kind of produce and agricultural products and plants. Right. Then from Africa, we have more plants, but also one of like kind of the big cash crops of the time, coffee. So we have okra, yams, collard greens. Europe is going to chip in mostly with domesticated animals. So we're going to see the dairy and the meat come from things like horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, chickens. Also a big advantage for the muscle power in war and for moving plows and materials, that kind of stuff. And then lastly, from the Americas moving the other way, they did have some very important things, like I mentioned before, corn or maize, potatoes, beans, tomatoes. So things that would make the old world diet much more well-rounded and healthy. Okay, so it says during this time period, what group of people was the largest contingent of migrants? And then we have to give an example of environmental effects that the Columbian exchange had. Okay, so sadly, the greatest group of migrants at this time, right down here, we're talking about the migration of enslaved peoples from Africa. And the connection that this has to the Columbian exchange is a super sad one. If something like 90 to 95% of the native populations die in the New World, that means that there's very few people there to resist Europeans. But it also means that there's not as many people there who are farming or producing agricultural products. And so when Europeans show up, they bring some European workers. They tried to use native workers, but many of them were dead already. And so they used the access to slavery to fill that labor role. And again, the Europeans did not invent slavery here. Slavery was a well-established trade commodity in African trade going back to the start of this course. But it was an available, cheap labor source. And things like sugar are super labor intensive. So they used one commodity, and then sadly, they just escalated the scale of it to go from something that was a small trade product into now the basis of profit in these plantations in the New World. And so the environmental effect that all of this is going to have is also quite large. So when you think about the fact that what used to be all these diverse products all around the world, each area kind of had its own specialties. Now that's not necessarily true, right? We're going to have potatoes not just in the Andes Mountains, but in North America, in Ireland, in Poland, in the Himalayas. So all of a sudden, one product is going to be feeding more people than it's ever done before. And so diversity of plants is going to decrease. Diversity of wildlife will decrease. And that's not just because of farming, it's also because of overexploitation of resources. So when we think about like all the fur trading and fur trapping in like the French Empire, for example, sadly, they hunted animals right into extinction, right? So that's a devastating effect. There's also around the Cape of Africa, Portuguese and Dutch sailors were landing on all these little Indian Ocean islands. And so, for example, something like the dodo bird, which was this small flightless bird, I shouldn't say small, it's kind of a football of a bird. But they didn't run away, which is why they were called dodos. And so sailors looking for fresh food on these long voyages would find dodos and hunt them because it was cheap meat. Eventually, they overhunted them to the point of extinction, right? So a major environmental concern at the time. And so then the last part here, it says describe how environmental and demographic effects that the Columbia Exchange had on Europe and the African locations. And so environmental and economic effects, more cash crops, greater stress placed on the natural resources in an area, exploitation of those resources. And what that meant, though, is like anywhere to make profit, that's what people were doing. So exploiting those resources, yes. Exploiting slavery, yes. And so that leads us to the demographic effect of moving labor from one place to another. So as natives, as their populations die, Africans are going to be forced to move to a new continent to make up a labor in plantation systems. Even Europeans, a large migration of Europeans to the New World. Long term, this will continue in these empires. And so as England's empire gets bigger, it's not uncommon to see, people from India now working in British colonies in South Africa, for example, or Irishmen being forced to work in Australia. So as empires grow, you see more movement of people across the globe. All right, guys, I hope this helped. Nice job.